Thomas Mitchell's weathered hands froze on the rusted bus door handle, his German shepherd Libby pressing against his trembling leg as they stared at what everyone else would call worthless scrap metal. The afternoon Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the skeletal remains of the old school bus, its yellow paint peeling like dead skin, windows shattered into jagged teeth that seemed to mock their desperate situation. This wasn't supposed to be home. Libby whined softly, her intelligent brown eyes reflecting the same hollow desperation that had driven them here. Two broken soldiers with nowhere left to run. The eviction notice crumpled in Tom's back pocket felt like a death sentence. But this rusted shell of a vehicle was their final stand, their last hope before the streets claimed them both. "Well, girl," Tom whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of 52 years of fighting wars, both foreign and domestic, "guess we're about to find out what we're really made of." What they were about to build in the coming months would either save them or destroy what little remained of the family that had already written them off as lost causes. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Mitchell family legacy sprawled across 40 acres of red Alabama clay, cotton fields that hadn't seen a crop in 15 years, stretching toward a horizon that promised nothing but more hardship. Thomas "Tom" Mitchell stood at 52 with the bearing of a man who'd carried the weight of other people's lives in his hands. Broad shoulders permanently set in a defensive hunch, steel-gray hair buzzed military short, and eyes the color of winter storms that had seen too much and forgiven too little. Beside him, Liberty, Libby to those who'd earned the right, sat with the dignified patience that only came from years of military service. The 8-year-old German shepherd's black and tan coat had silvered around her muzzle, battle scars hidden beneath thick fur that told stories of roadside bombs and midnight raids in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that unnerved civilians and comforted soldiers, always watching, always calculating, always ready to place herself between Tom and whatever threatened him. 3 months ago, Tom had owned a modest ranch house 20 miles south, complete with mortgage payments and a bank account that allowed him to sleep without counting pennies. That was before the medical bills started arriving like artillery rounds, each one chipping away at his financial defenses until there was nothing left but this abandoned family farm and the rusted school bus that had been rotting in the backfield since his father's death. Dorothy "Dot" Mitchell, 74 years old and tough as the hickory trees that lined the property, had raised Tom to believe that Mitchells didn't quit, didn't complain, and sure as hell didn't live in school buses like vagabonds. The retired elementary school teacher carried herself with the ramrod posture of someone who'd spent 40 years commanding respect from unruly children, her silver hair always perfectly styled, her house dresses pressed and proper even when the world was falling apart around her. Then there were Tom's children, Rebecca, 30, an ICU nurse whose dedication to saving other people's families hadn't saved her own, and Christopher, 27, a former bank loan officer whose recent termination had everything to do with defending his father's honor on social media and nothing to do with his work performance. Both lived with the particular burden of loving someone they couldn't understand, watching their father disappear piece by piece into a war that had supposedly ended years ago. The neighboring O'Sullivan farm belonged to Margaret "Maggie" O'Sullivan, a 68-year-old Irish-American widow whose husband had left her 40 acres and a loneliness so profound it had its own gravitational pull. She'd watched the Mitchell family drama unfold from her kitchen window for months, saying nothing but seeing everything, the way widows in small towns learn to do. This was the cast of characters whose lives would collide around one rusted school bus, where pride would battle desperation, where family loyalty would be tested against social expectations, and where an old soldier and his faithful dog would either find redemption or lose everything they had left to lose. The first morning in the bus, Tom woke to Libby's low growl vibrating against his chest. Through the cracked windshield, a white county pickup truck sat idling at the property line, exhaust visible in the cool dawn air. Wayne Hutchins, the county code enforcement officer, stepped out wearing the uncomfortable expression of a man paid to deliver bad news to people who'd already heard too much of it. "Morning, Tom," Hutchins called, his voice carrying across the field with the authority of officialdom. "Got some folks downtown asking questions about your living situation here." Tom emerged from the bus, Libby flanking his right side in perfect military formation. The morning sun caught the worst of the rust streaks, making the old vehicle look like it was bleeding. "It's my land, Wayne. Been in my family for 3 generations." "I know that." Hutchins pulled out a clipboard, the bureaucratic shield that transformed neighbors into adversaries. "But there's regulations about habitable dwellings. This here bus, well, it ain't exactly up to code." The irony wasn't lost on Tom. He'd spent 6 years diffusing improvised explosive devices in places where code meant staying alive another day, and now he was being lectured about building permits on his own family's land. Libby sensed his rising tension and pressed closer, her presence a steady reminder to breathe, to think before reacting. "How long do I have?" Tom asked. 90 days to bring it up to standards or find somewhere else." Hutchins looked genuinely sorry as he handed over the official notice. "I got my orders, Tom. Wish it was different." After Hutchins left, Tom sat on the bus steps and spread the notice across his knees. Libby settled beside him, her weight warm and solid against his leg. 90 days to transform this rust bucket into something the county would consider habitable. The challenge should have felt impossible, but instead it felt like the first clear mission he'd been given since coming home. The work began with demolition. Years of abandonment had filled the bus with the detritus of rural decay, rotted seat cushions, rusted springs, a family of possums who'd claimed the back exit as their ancestral home. Tom worked methodically, the way he'd been trained to approach dangerous situations, carefully, systematically, with respect for what could go wrong. Libby proved an invaluable assistant, her sensitive nose detecting structural weaknesses before Tom's eyes could spot them. When she whined and scratched at a section of flooring near the driver's seat, Tom pried up the panel to find the metal completely corroded through. Left alone, it would have collapsed under the weight of furniture, or worse, a person. "Good girl," he murmured, scratching behind her ears. "Still watching my 6 after all these years?" 3 days into the project, Dorothy arrived unannounced, her ancient Lincoln Continental kicking up a dust cloud as it navigated the rutted farm road. She emerged wearing her church dress and the expression of a woman who'd come to deliver a reckoning. "Thomas Mitchell," she called, her voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect from 30 years of 4th graders. "What in the Sam Hill do you think you're doing out here?" Tom straightened, crowbar still in hand, sweat staining his work shirt. At 52, he could still feel like a scolded child under his mother's disapproving gaze. "I'm making a home, Mama." "A home?" Dorothy's laugh held no humor. "Son, this is a rusted-out school bus in the middle of a cotton field. This is what people do when they've given up on life, not when they're making one." Libby rose from her spot in the shade, positioning herself between Tom and the rising tension. Dorothy's eyes softened slightly at the sight of the old dog, one of the few creatures on earth who could penetrate her armor of maternal disappointment. "I didn't raise no quitter, Thomas," Dorothy continued, her voice gentler but no less firm. "Your daddy worked these fields until his hands bled to give you better than this, And here you are, living like some kind of vagrant with nothing but that dog for company." The words hit harder than any roadside bomb ever had. Tom felt his chest tighten, the familiar panic clawing at the edges of his vision. But Libby was there, pressing against his leg with the practiced pressure that grounded him, reminded him to breathe. "This dog," Tom said quietly, "has saved my life more times than I can count. And maybe this bus ain't much to look at now, but it's mine. It's ours. And we're going to make it into something you can be proud of." Dorothy studied her son's face, seeing something there she hadn't noticed before. Not the defeat she'd expected, but determination. The same stubborn Mitchell pride that had built this farm, fought in 3 wars, and refused to surrender even when surrender made sense. 90 days, she said finally, holding up the county notice Tom had left on his truck seat. "That's not much time for miracles, son." "No, ma'am," Tom agreed, "but it's enough time to get started." 2 weeks into the renovation, Tom made a discovery that changed everything. He was reinforcing the floor joists when Libby began exhibiting behavior he'd never seen before, pacing in tight circles near the rear emergency exit, whining with an urgency that made his combat instincts flare to life. She scratched at a specific section of wall paneling with such persistence that Tom finally set down his tools and investigated. The panel came loose easier than it should have, revealing a hollow space behind the bus's interior wall. Inside, wrapped in yellowed oilcloth, lay a collection of items that made Tom's breath catch. His grandfather's Purple Heart from World War II, a bundle of love letters between his parents, and a leather journal filled with his grandfather's handwriting. But it was the veterinary records that stopped his heart cold. According to the military documents tucked between the journal pages, Libby had never been spayed. The paperwork clearly showed intact female in multiple places, contradicting everything Tom had been told when she was assigned to him as his service dog. He stared at the records, understanding dawning like a slow-motion explosion in his mind. "Jesus, girl," he whispered, looking at Libby with new eyes. "How long have you been hiding this?" As if summoned by his realization, Libby's behavior over the past few days suddenly made sense. The increased appetite, the protective circling, the way she'd been arranging blankets in the corner of the bus. Tom's hands shook as he called the only veterinarian in town who would see them without payment up front. Dr. Sarah Chen confirmed what Tom already suspected. "She's about 6 weeks along," she said, running her hands expertly over Libby's abdomen. "I'd say 4, maybe 5 puppies." "You didn't know?" Tom shook his head, still reeling from the implications. A pregnant service dog living in an unconverted school bus with winter approaching. It was a scenario that would give social services and animal control all the ammunition they needed to separate them permanently. "Doc," he said carefully, "what are the chances she could deliver safely in less than ideal conditions?" Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. "German Shepherds are generally good mothers, but she's 8 years old, which puts her in the geriatric pregnancy category. She'll need a warm, clean environment, proper nutrition, and medical support if complications arise. Mr. Mitchell, I have to ask, do you have somewhere appropriate for her to give birth?" The bus renovation, which had felt like a manageable challenge, suddenly became a race against time. Tom threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The interior walls went up in record time, insulation packed tight against the Alabama cold that would come whether he was ready or not. He scavenged materials from abandoned farms, traded labor for supplies, and worked by flashlight when daylight failed him. Christopher arrived on a Thursday afternoon, stepping out of his sedan with the careful expression of someone expecting disappointment. At 27, he carried himself with the cautious optimism of a man whose faith in his father had been tested too many times. But when he climbed the steps into the bus, his criticism died in his throat. The interior had been transformed into something approaching livability. Tom had framed out a small living area with a wood-burning stove, built custom cabinetry from reclaimed barnwood, and installed windows that actually opened and closed. The craftsmanship was precise, methodical, clearly the work of someone who understood that details mattered. "Dad," Chris said, running his hand along a perfectly fitted joint, "this is incredible. I had no idea you could do work like this." Tom paused in his installation of water lines, seeing his son clearly for the first time in months. Chris looked thinner than he remembered, stress lines around his eyes that spoke of recent struggles. "Your grandfather taught me. Same way his grandfather taught him. Guess I never thought you'd be interested." "I got fired last week," Chris said abruptly, as if the words had been building pressure like steam in a kettle. "Posted something on LinkedIn defending you and my boss saw it. Said I showed poor judgment associating our company with vagrant activities." The wrench slipped in Tom's grip, nearly catching his knuckles. His son had sacrificed his career to defend him, and Tom had been so wrapped up in his own problems he hadn't even noticed. "Chris, I'm sorry. I never meant for this to affect your—" "I'm not sorry," Chris interrupted. "I'm tired of pretending you're something to be ashamed of. You served your country, you earned your benefits, and if you want to live in a school bus with your dog, that's your business." Libby, as if sensing the emotional weight of the moment, padded over and rested her head on Chris's knee. He scratched behind her ears absently, then noticed the way her sides had filled out. "Dad," he said slowly, "is Libby pregnant?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to voice. A pregnant dog meant veterinary bills, complications, and a level of responsibility that the county would certainly use against them. "About 4 weeks to go," Tom admitted. "She's going to need a proper whelping box, heat lamps, the whole setup. I'm working on it." Chris looked around the bus interior with new eyes, calculating square footage and logistics. "Where?" Tom pointed to the rear section where he'd begun framing out what would become a bedroom. "Back there." "I can build a partition, create a nursery area that can be converted later." "Let me help," Chris said. It wasn't a question or an offer, it was a decision. "I've got nothing but time now, and it looks like you could use an extra pair of hands." For the first time in months, Tom felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. His son was here, offering to help, and Libby was going to have puppies in the home they were building together. Maybe Dorothy was wrong. Maybe this wasn't giving up on life. Maybe it was finally learning how to live it. The transformation accelerated once Chris committed to the project. Father and son fell into a rhythm born of shared purpose. Tom's military precision complementing Chris's methodical banking background as they tackled electrical systems, plumbing, and the dozens of small details that separated shelter from home. Libby supervised from her increasingly elaborate nest in the corner, her maternal instincts sharpening as her body prepared for the responsibility ahead. Margaret O'Sullivan appeared on their third week of collaboration, emerging from her ancient Ford pickup with a casserole dish and the determined expression of a woman on a mission. At 68, Maggie carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who'd outlived most of her critics and had little patience for the remainder. "Figured you boys might be getting tired of bologna sandwiches," she announced, climbing the bus steps without invitation. Her Irish accent had faded to a gentle lilt after 40 years in Alabama, but it strengthened when she was emotional or angry. "And I wanted to see what all the fuss was about." She paused in the doorway, taking in the transformed interior with the practiced eye of someone who'd watched 3 generations of her own family struggle against poverty and circumstance. The bus now felt less like a vehicle and more like a tiny house. Walls painted warm cream, windows framed with salvaged wood, floors covered with remnants of carpet Chris had convinced a local supplier to donate. "Well, I'll be damned," she murmured, then caught herself. "Pardon my language. Thomas, this is beautiful work. Your grandfather would be proud." The mention of his grandfather sparked something in Tom's memory. He retrieved the leather journal from its place of honor on the makeshift mantel and opened it to a passage he'd been reading each morning like a prayer. "He wrote something here," Tom said, finding the page. "A man's home isn't measured by its size or cost, but by the love that builds it and the peace that fills it." I think about that every time I get frustrated with the cramped quarters or the lack of proper insulation. Maggie accepted the journal with reverent hands, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Patrick Mitchell was a good man, helped my Sean with our barn raising back in '78. Never asked for anything in return except maybe a jar of my strawberry preserves." She paused, studying Tom with new interest. "You have his hands and his heart, I suspect." The community's reaction proved more complex than simple opposition. While some neighbors complained to the county about property values and unsightly conditions, others began stopping by with donations, a spare window here, leftover lumber there, advice about winterizing pipes. The local VFW post took up a collection for insulation materials, and Dr. Chen reduced her fees for Libby's prenatal care. But the negative attention intensified as well. Someone had posted photos of the bus on social media with mocking captions about homeless veterans and government handouts. The images spread through local Facebook groups with the viral intensity of small-town scandal. Rebecca saw them first during her night shift at the hospital and called her father at 2 a.m, her voice tight with professional embarrassment. "Dad, you need to see what people are saying online. They're calling you busman and sharing pictures like you're some kind of local freak show. My supervisor asked me today if you were mentally stable." I didn't know what to tell her. Tom sat in his nearly completed bedroom, Libby pressed against his legs, feeling the familiar weight of shame settling over him like a heavy blanket. His daughter was suffering professional consequences for his choices, just as Chris had lost his job. The pattern felt sickeningly familiar, his inability to function normally in civilian society, creating collateral damage among the people he loved most. "Maybe they're right," he said quietly. "Maybe this whole thing is just another way of avoiding real life." "Don't you dare!" Chris interrupted from the next room where he'd been installing cabinet hardware. "Don't you dare let them get in your head like that. You know what I saw today? I saw a man building something beautiful with his own hands. I saw someone who found a way to create stability and purpose when the whole world seemed determined to take it away from him." The conversation was interrupted by Libby's sharp bark of alarm. Through the window they could see headlights approaching, multiple vehicles moving slowly up the farm road. Tom's combat instincts engaged automatically as he counted at least 4 cars in what looked like a news van. The convoy stopped at the property line, and Tom watched with growing dread as people emerged. Neighbors he recognized, strangers with cameras, and Wayne Hutchins looking deeply uncomfortable in his official capacity. Someone had organized a confrontation, and Tom was about to become the unwilling center of attention. "Thomas Mitchell," called a voice from the crowd. He recognized Martha Pemberton, president of the Riverside Neighborhood Association and owner of the largest house within a 2-mile radius of the farm. "We need to have a conversation about this situation you've created." Tom stepped outside, Chris and Maggie flanking him in an impromptu show of support. Libby remained inside on Chris's strict orders. Her condition made stress potentially dangerous, and the crowd's hostile energy was palpable, even from a distance. "Mrs. Pemberton," Tom replied evenly, "this is private property. You're welcome to state your business, but I'd appreciate it if you kept your distance from my home." "Your home?" Martha's laugh carried clearly across the field. "Mr. Mitchell, this is a school bus. A rusted-out vehicle that belongs in a junkyard, not in a residential area. You're affecting property values, violating health codes, and frankly, setting a terrible example for the community's children. Behind her, several neighbors nodded agreement, though Tom noticed others hanging back with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy. The local news camera was rolling, turning private family business into public spectacle. "I've got proper permits," Tom said, producing the county paperwork Wayne had helped him file. "Water, septic, electrical, all inspected and approved. This is legally classified as a mobile home on agricultural property." "Legal doesn't make it right," Martha shot back. "We've worked hard to build a respectable community here." "We pay taxes, maintain our properties, and follow social norms. We don't live like vagrants in abandoned vehicles." The word vagrant hit Tom like a physical blow. He felt his chest tighten, the familiar symptoms of panic beginning to edge his vision. But before he could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Martha Pemberton, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." Dorothy Mitchell emerged from her Lincoln Continental with the righteous fury of a woman who'd reached her limit. At 74, she commanded attention through pure force of personality, her church dress and pearls armor against anyone who might question her authority. This man served 3 tours of duty defending your right to stand on his property and insult him. He earned a Purple Heart saving other soldiers' lives, and he came home to a country that promised to take care of him and then broke that promise at every turn. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Dorothy continued her advance, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding respect from unruly children. "You want to talk about setting examples for children? How about teaching them that we take care of our veterans instead of shaming them for finding creative solutions to problems we helped create?" Martha tried to interrupt, but Dorothy was just getting started. "My son is building a home with his own 2 hands on land his great-grandfather paid for with cotton and sweat. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, maybe you should examine what kind of person that makes you." The confrontation might have escalated further, but Libby's urgent barking from inside the bus cut through the argument. Tom recognized the sound immediately. It wasn't alarm or aggression, but the specific vocalization she used to alert him to her medical needs. "She's in labor," he announced, his priorities instantly shifting from public relations to crisis management. The crowd's hostility seemed suddenly petty compared to the life-and-death responsibility of helping Libby through a difficult delivery. Dr. Chen arrived within 30 minutes, having been on standby for exactly this situation. By then, the protesters had largely dispersed, their appetite for conflict diminished by the reality of emergency veterinary care. Only Maggie and Dorothy remained, along with Chris, who had appointed himself head of logistics for the impromptu delivery room. The first puppy arrived just after midnight, followed by 3 more over the next 2 hours. Tom assisted with the practiced calm of someone who'd dealt with medical emergencies in far worse conditions, while Libby demonstrated why German Shepherds had been trusted with military responsibilities for over a century. She was focused, efficient, and completely in control despite being a first-time mother. As dawn broke over the Alabama cotton fields, Tom sat beside Libby's whelping box, watching 4 perfect puppies nurse with the single-minded determination of the very young. Chris dozed in the corner chair, exhausted by a night of anxiety and awe. Dorothy had returned home promising to bring breakfast, and Maggie was already planning puppy-proofing modifications for the bus. Looking around the space they'd created together, warm, clean, and filled with new life, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of the crushing weight he'd carried since coming home from the war. For the first time, the bus felt not like a refuge from the world, but like a foundation for building something better. The puppy's soft whimpers mixed with Libby's contented breathing, creating a soundtrack of hope that seemed to promise that broken things could indeed become beautiful, given enough time, love, and the courage to keep building. The viral video started innocuously enough. Someone in Martha Pemberton's crowd had filmed the confrontation on their phone, capturing Dorothy's fierce defense of her son and the moment Tom rushed inside to help Libby deliver her puppies. But it was the follow-up footage, shot through the bus windows as Tom gently assisted with the birth, that transformed local controversy into national sensation. The caption read, "Homeless veteran delivers puppies in school bus while neighbors protest his existence." Within 48 hours, the video had been shared across every major social media platform, accumulating millions of views and tens of thousands of comments ranging from outraged support to vicious criticism. Rebecca called during her lunch break, her voice strained with exhaustion and embarrassment. "Dad, it's everywhere. CNN, Fox News, even the Today Show is talking about it. My co-workers are asking if you're really my father, and I don't know what to tell them anymore." Tom sat on the bus steps, watching the puppies stumble around their enclosure on unsteady legs, while news vans lined the property entrance like military vehicles at a checkpoint. The media attention had brought supporters, veterans driving from 3 states away to offer assistance, animal lovers sending donations, construction workers volunteering their skills during weekends. But it had also attracted protesters, government officials, and the kind of scrutiny that made simple tasks like grocery shopping impossible. The county, feeling pressure from both sides, had accelerated their timeline. Wayne Hutchins delivered the news with obvious reluctance, his official demeanor barely concealing his personal distress at being forced to take action against a fellow veteran. "Tom, I'm sorry, but the state's getting involved now. Too much public attention. They're sending inspectors next week, and if everything isn't up to full residential code by then, they've got authority to condemn the structure and remove you immediately." The timeline was impossible. Full residential code meant septic systems, electrical panels, handicap accessibility, modifications that would cost thousands of dollars and weeks of professional installation. Tom had accomplished miracles with salvaged materials and volunteer labor, but he couldn't conjure building permits and certified inspections out of determination alone. Chris threw himself into research with the desperate energy of someone watching his family dissolve in real time. He called every veterans organization in Alabama, contacted legal aid societies, and spent sleepless nights navigating the bureaucratic maze of housing regulations and military benefits. His efforts yielded small victories: a lawyer willing to work pro bono, a building supply company offering materials at cost, but nothing that solved the fundamental problem of time and money. The stress was taking its toll on everyone. Dorothy's carefully maintained facade of strength began showing cracks during her daily visits, her movements slower, her color occasionally off in ways that concerned Tom but which she dismissed as just tired. Libby's maternal instincts had her constantly on edge, the combination of protective hormones and external chaos making her hypervigilant in ways that reminded Tom uncomfortably of their early days in combat zones. The breaking point came during what should have been a moment of celebration. The puppies, now 3 weeks old, had opened their eyes and begun exploring beyond their whelping box. Tom was documenting their progress with photos to send to the families who'd already expressed interest in adoption when a convoy of official vehicles approached the property. Leading the procession was a black SUV carrying Patricia Trish Hartwell, Tom's ex-wife, accompanied by her current husband David, a successful attorney whose tailored suit looked absurdly out of place in the rural Alabama setting. Behind them came 2 county officials, a representative from the state health department, and what appeared to be a social worker carrying an official-looking briefcase. Tom watched the approaching delegation with the cold calm that had once served him well in hostile territory. This wasn't a routine inspection, it was an intervention, and everyone involved knew it. Patricia emerged from the SUV with the careful composure of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of difficult conversations. At 48, she remained attractive in the polished way of professional women who'd learned to armor themselves against disappointment, Her presence here could only mean one thing. She'd come to take the children. "Hello, Tom," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "We need to talk." David positioned himself slightly behind his wife, close enough to show support, but far enough to avoid direct confrontation. The other officials hung back, content to let family drama play out before asserting their authority. "If this is about the kids visiting," Tom said, "they're adults. They make their own decisions about where to spend their time." "This is about their safety," Patricia replied, gesturing toward the bus and the media circus surrounding it. "Tom, look at this situation objectively. You're living in a vehicle with no permanent utilities, surrounded by protesters and journalists. Chris lost his job defending you, and Rebecca's professional reputation is suffering because of the association. This has to stop." The accusation hit harder because it contained elements of truth. Tom had watched his children sacrifice their own stability to support his choices, and the guilt was eating at him like acid. But the bus represented more than shelter. It was proof that he could still build something meaningful, still contribute something valuable to the world. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said quietly. "I'm living on my own land, paying my taxes, bothering nobody who doesn't come here looking for trouble." "You're hurting your children," Patricia shot back, her composed facade cracking slightly. "You're hurting your mother, who's worried sick about you. And you're hurting yourself, though you're too stubborn to see it." David stepped forward, his legal training evident in his careful phrasing. "Tom, we're not here to attack you. But there are resources available. Veterans housing programs, mental health services, career retraining opportunities. You don't have to live like this." The phrase, "live like this," hung in the air like an accusation. Tom looked around at what he'd built, the warm, clean interior of the bus, Libby nursing her puppies in their custom-designed whelping area, the vegetable garden Chris had helped him plant, the workshop where he'd begun crafting furniture from reclaimed wood. To him, it looked like home. To them, it looked like failure. The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected ally. Maggie O'Sullivan's pickup truck bounced up the farm road at a speed that suggested urgency, and she emerged already talking before her feet hit the ground. "Patricia Hartwell, I should have known you'd show up eventually," Maggie announced, her Irish accent thickening with indignation. 40 years I've been watching this family, and you've got some nerve coming here to lecture Tom about responsibility." Patricia turned toward the interruption with visible irritation. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is a private family matter." "Nothing's private when you bring half the county government with you," Maggie interrupted. "And since I've known Tom since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, I'd say I've got standing to speak my mind." The older woman positioned herself firmly between Tom and the officials, her small frame somehow commanding attention despite being outnumbered and outranked. "You want to talk about resources and programs?" Maggie continued, addressing the group. "How about the program that sent Tom to war 3 times and brought him home with his mind full of ghosts? How about the resources that were supposed to help him transition back to civilian life but instead got him tangled up in paperwork and bureaucracy for years?" She gestured toward the bus with obvious pride. "That man took a piece of junk and turned it into a home. He's raising puppies that will bring joy to families across the state. He's teaching his son skills that will serve him for life. And you people want to tear it all down, because it doesn't look like what you think success should look like." The social worker stepped forward, consulting her clipboard with the detached professionalism of someone who'd had similar conversations hundreds of times. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but there are legitimate safety and health issues here. The living conditions don't meet minimum standards for—" Her explanation was cut short by Libby's sudden, urgent barking from inside the bus. Tom recognized the sound immediately, not alarm or aggression, but the specific warning she used when she detected something wrong that he couldn't see. "Something's wrong with the puppies," he said, brushing past the assembled officials without regard for protocol or consequences. The confrontation about housing codes and family dynamics suddenly seemed trivial compared to the immediate crisis of 4 vulnerable lives depending on him. Inside the bus, Tom found one of the puppies, the smallest female, lying motionless while Libby paced frantically around the whelping box. The puppy's breathing was shallow and irregular, her tiny body cooler than it should be. Tom's combat medic training kicked in automatically as he assessed the situation and began emergency warming procedures. "Chris, call Dr. Chen," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. "Tell her we've got a fading puppy syndrome situation and need her here immediately." The crisis transformed the dynamic outside the bus. Patricia found herself holding blankets while David used his phone to coordinate with the veterinary clinic. The social worker and county officials stood awkwardly aside as the family focused on the immediate emergency with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke of deep, instinctive bonds. Dr. Chen arrived within 20 minutes, her professional calm a steadying presence as she examined the struggling puppy. "She's hypothermic and hypoglycemic," she announced after a quick assessment. "Probably a developmental issue with temperature regulation. We can treat it, but she'll need round-the-clock monitoring for the next 48 hours. Tom looked around the bus that had become the center of so much controversy, seeing it now through different eyes. The warm, clean space that he'd built with his own hands wasn't just adequate for the emergency, it was ideal. The custom temperature controls, the easy, clean surfaces, the careful organization that allowed quick access to supplies. Everything he'd designed for comfort had inadvertently created the perfect intensive care environment. "She stays here," he said firmly, meeting Patricia's eyes with quiet determination. "This is where she belongs. This is where they all belong." For the first time since her arrival, Patricia's composed mask slipped completely. Looking at her ex-husband tenderly warming a dying puppy while his service dog watched with anxious devotion, she saw not the broken man she'd divorced, but the soldier who'd once been willing to risk everything to save others. The standoff wasn't resolved that evening, but something fundamental had shifted. The officials departed with promises to return, but their authority seemed diminished in the face of immediate need being met with competent care. Patricia left with David, but not before quietly asking Tom to call her with updates on the puppy's condition. As night fell over the Alabama cotton fields, Tom sat beside Libby's whelping box with the sick puppy wrapped in heated blankets on his lap. The media vans had disappeared, the protesters had gone home, and the bus felt like what it had always been in his mind, not a symbol of failure or success, but simply home. The puppy's breathing steadied as the hours passed, her tiny heart beating stronger against Tom's palm. Outside, the familiar sounds of rural night settled over the property. Crickets, distant traffic, the whisper of wind through cotton plants that had waited 40 years for someone to care about them again. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning when Dorothy collapsed in her kitchen while making coffee. The neighbor who found her, Mrs. Henderson from next door, called 911 first and Tom second, her voice shaking with the particular terror that comes from watching someone you've known for decades suddenly become fragile and mortal. Tom arrived at the hospital to find his mother conscious but diminished, her skin pale as tissue paper and her eyes holding the bewildered look of someone whose body had betrayed her without warning. Rebecca was already there, still in her scrubs from the night shift, her professional composure barely containing her personal panic. "The tests show extensive metastasis," Dr. Morrison explained with the gentle directness of an oncologist who delivered similar news countless times. "The cancer has spread to her liver, her lungs, and several lymph nodes." "I'm afraid we're looking at weeks, not months." The words hit Tom like sniper fire, sudden, devastating, and impossible to defend against. Dorothy had been his anchor, the one constant in a life that had been systematically stripped of certainties. The idea of losing her now, when he'd just begun to rebuild something resembling stability, felt like cosmic cruelty. "I want to go home," Dorothy said from her hospital bed, her voice carrying the stubborn authority that had commanded respect from generations of fourth graders. "I don't want to die in some sterile room surrounded by machines and strangers." Rebecca exchanged a meaningful look with Dr. Morrison, her medical training warring with her role as daughter. "Mom, you'll need round-the-clock care, pain management, specialized equipment. Home health services in rural areas are limited, and Dad's living situation isn't exactly—" "Your daddy will take care of me," Dorothy interrupted with absolute certainty. "That boy has been taking care of people his whole life, even when it nearly killed him. If I'm going to die, I want it to be somewhere that feels like home." The logistics seemed impossible. Dorothy's house hadn't been properly maintained in years. The wiring was suspect, the plumbing unreliable, and the isolation that had once felt peaceful now seemed dangerously remote from medical assistance. Tom's bus, while clean and comfortable, was barely large enough for him and Libby, let alone additional medical equipment and a patient requiring constant care. The second catastrophe arrived that afternoon in the form of a certified letter from Chris's apartment complex. The eviction notice cited failure to pay rent and gave him 30 days to vacate or face legal action. Tom's son had apparently been using his unemployment benefits to purchase materials for the bus renovation instead of covering his own basic living expenses. "I didn't want to worry you," Chris admitted when confronted, his voice carrying the hollow shame of a man who'd gambled everything on hope and lost. "I thought I'd find another job before it became a problem. I thought helping you with the bus would show potential employers that I had practical skills. Initiative, you know?" Tom felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like lead armor. His choices had cost Chris his career, and now his son was facing homelessness while Tom played house in a converted school bus. The irony was devastating. He'd built a home for himself while his family fell apart around him. The third blow came from an unexpected direction. Libby, still recovering from delivery and stressed by the constant chaos surrounding the property, developed what Dr. Chen diagnosed as mastitis, a painful infection of her mammary glands that made nursing difficult and potentially dangerous for the puppies. "She needs antibiotics and complete rest," Dr. Chen explained, administering the first injection with practiced efficiency. "No stress, no excitement, and the puppies will need to be bottle-fed for at least a week. It's manageable, but it requires constant attention." Tom looked around the bus that had felt spacious when it was just him and Libby, trying to imagine how it could accommodate Dorothy's medical needs, Chris's displaced possessions, 4 puppies requiring round-the-clock feeding, and a sick dog who needed quiet recovery. The mathematics of care didn't add up, no matter how he calculated the space and time. The breaking point came that evening when Martha Pemberton returned with a larger group of neighbors and what appeared to be a lawyer. This time, however, the confrontation felt different, less like harassment and more like an intervention organized by people who'd convinced themselves they were acting from genuine concern. "Tom, we've all been talking," Martha began, her voice carrying the false warmth of someone delivering ultimatums dressed as charity. "We realize this situation has gotten out of hand for everyone involved. Your family is falling apart. Your mother is dying. Your son is losing his apartment. And you're trying to manage it all from a school bus that isn't equipped for any of this." Behind her, several neighbors nodded agreement with expressions of concerned sympathy that felt more dangerous than outright hostility. Tom recognized the particular threat of people who'd decided to save him from himself. "We've taken up a collection," Martha continued, producing an envelope from her purse. "Enough to get you started in a proper rental somewhere in town, close to medical facilities and social services, a place where your mother can receive appropriate care and your son can get back on his feet." The offer hung in the air like poisoned bait. Tom could see the appeal of their solution. Surrender the bus, accept their charity, return to conventional living arrangements that made everyone else comfortable. It would solve the immediate crises of housing and medical care while eliminating the controversy that had made his family a target of both support and criticism. But it would also mean admitting that everything he'd built meant nothing. The bus represented more than shelter. It was proof that he could still create something meaningful, still contribute value to the world, still be more than a broken veteran accepting handouts from a society that preferred its heroes safely categorized and conveniently invisible. "I appreciate the offer," Tom said carefully, his military training helping him maintain composure while his world crumbled around him. "But this is my home, my family's home. We'll figure out a way to make it work." Martha's expression hardened at his refusal. "Tom, be realistic. Your mother needs hospice care, not wishful thinking. Your son needs stability, not some fantasy about living off the grid in a converted vehicle. And those puppies deserve better than being raised in what amounts to a homeless shelter." The accusation about the puppies hit hardest because it contained truth he couldn't deny. Libby's illness, combined with the stress of constant conflict and media attention, was affecting her ability to care for her offspring. The smallest puppy, despite surviving her initial crisis, remained fragile and underweight. Tom was failing in his most basic responsibility, protecting the vulnerable lives that depended on him. That night, alone in the bus with a sick dog, 4 hungry puppies, and the weight of impossible choices, Tom felt the familiar darkness closing in. The panic attacks he'd managed to control through physical labor and purposeful activity began returning with a vengeance. His hands shook as he prepared bottles for the puppies. His breathing became shallow and rapid, and the walls of his carefully constructed sanctuary seemed to close in like the boundaries of a tomb. Libby, despite her own pain and exhaustion, sensed his distress and struggled to her feet, pressing her warm body against his legs in the gesture that had saved his sanity countless times over the years. But even her presence couldn't push back the crushing realization that everything he'd built was about to collapse. The county inspector arrived the next morning with demolition equipment and a court order. Wayne Hutchins looked genuinely apologetic as he delivered the news, but his personal feelings couldn't override legal authority. "I'm sorry, Tom. The state health department has deemed the structure unsuitable for human habitation given your mother's medical needs and the presence of minor dependents, the puppies. You've got 24 hours to vacate before we're required to condemn the building." Tom stood in the doorway of his home, looking out at the assembled crowd of officials, neighbors, reporters, and curiosity seekers who'd gathered to witness his defeat. The bus behind him held everything he'd managed to salvage from a life that seemed determined to strip away anything he tried to hold on to. Dorothy's voice came from her hospital bed that afternoon, weak but determined. "Thomas, sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is retreat and regroup. This isn't surrender, it's strategy." But standing in the ruins of his carefully constructed life, watching his family suffer the consequences of his stubborn pride, Tom couldn't see any strategy that led to victory. For the first time since coming home from war, he began to wonder if everyone else was right. Maybe he really was too broken to function in the world they all seemed to navigate so easily. The sun set over the Alabama cotton fields one last time with Tom Mitchell as their guardian, and tomorrow would bring whatever came after. Hope had finally died. The first revelation came at 3 a.m, delivered by Chris in a voice thick with exhaustion and disbelief. He'd been sorting through Dorothy's papers to prepare for hospice care when he discovered a manila envelope marked Thomas Military Records hidden behind her bedroom dresser. "Dad, you need to see this," Chris said, spreading the documents across Dorothy's kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. "These aren't the records you showed us. These are your actual service files." Tom's hands trembled as he recognized the official letterhead of the Department of Defense, the classification stamps that marked information deemed too sensitive for civilian consumption. The records painted a picture drastically different from the narrative of failure and instability that had followed him home from war. The Purple Heart citation told the real story. Staff Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, for extraordinary heroism and action against an armed enemy. While conducting route clearance operations, SSG Mitchell identified and neutralized 17 improvised explosive devices, preventing an estimated 43 coalition casualties. When his unit came under direct fire during the final disposal, SSG Mitchell remained exposed to enemy contact for 27 minutes to complete the mission, sustaining injuries in the process. But it was the final document that changed everything. His discharge paperwork, stamped honorable, and bearing the signature of a commanding officer who'd written in the comments section, SSG Mitchell requested early separation to provide care for injured military working dog, recommended for immediate veteran benefits, and commendation for extraordinary dedication to duty. "You didn't get kicked out," Chris said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You left to save Libby." The truth unraveled like a controlled demolition. Tom had never been discharged for PTSD or disciplinary issues. He'd voluntarily ended his military career when the Army decided Libby's injuries made her unsuitable for continued service and scheduled her for euthanization. His choice had been stark: abandon his battle partner or sacrifice his pension and career trajectory to ensure her survival. Dorothy had been listening from the doorway, her frail body supported by a walker, but her mind sharp despite the morphine coursing through her system. "Thomas," she whispered, "why didn't you tell us?" Tom looked at his mother, seeing the pain in her eyes that came from years of misunderstanding. "Because everyone needed someone to blame for why I couldn't adjust to civilian life. It was easier to let you think I'd failed than to admit I chose to fail." The second revelation came 12 hours later, delivered by Patricia in the sterile waiting room of the regional medical center where Dorothy had been transferred for pain management. Tom's ex-wife looked haggard, her perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated guilt. "I need to tell you something," Patricia said, her voice barely audible above the institutional hum of hospital machinery. "About the divorce, about why I really left." Tom had assumed for years that Patricia couldn't handle his PTSD symptoms, the sleepless nights and sudden rages that had made their house feel like a combat zone, but the truth was more complex and infinitely more painful. "I left because I was jealous," she admitted, the words seeming to physically hurt as she spoke them. "Jealous of a dog. You came home from war and you could barely look at me or the kids without flinching, but you could sleep peacefully with Libby next to your bed. You could laugh when she did something silly, be gentle when she was scared. She got parts of you that I couldn't reach anymore." The confession hung between them like shrapnel, jagged and dangerous to touch. Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that signaled incoming panic, but Patricia continued before he could process the implications. "I thought if I took the kids and left, you'd get help. Real help. I thought losing us would force you to choose between healing and hiding. I never imagined you'd just hide deeper." Patricia reached into her purse and withdrew a bank statement that made Tom's vision blur. The account showed monthly deposits of significant amounts, all marked as transfers from P. Hartwell and all dated after their divorce had been finalized. "I've been anonymously paying into your veteran benefits account for 6 years, she said. "All those medical bills you couldn't afford, the house payments you made when you should have been broke, I was covering the difference. David doesn't know. Nobody knows." The third revelation came from the most unexpected source. Maggie O'Sullivan arrived at the hospital carrying a leather portfolio that looked older than the state of Alabama itself. Her usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by the solemn gravitas of someone about to alter the fundamental assumptions that governed everyone's understanding of reality. "Thomas," "We need to talk about the land," she said, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair with the deliberate movements of someone who'd made a difficult decision. "About what's really under those cotton fields." The Geological Survey had been commissioned 40 years earlier when Maggie's husband, Sean, had considered selling their farm to a mining company. The results had been so extraordinary that they'd decided to keep the information secret, fearing that industrial development would destroy the rural community they'd spent their lives building. "Rare earth clay deposits," Maggie explained, spreading maps and technical documents across the hospital bed table. "The kind they use in electronics, medical devices, space program applications. Conservative estimates put the value at somewhere north of $15 million. Tom stared at the survey maps, seeing his family's property outlined in red and marked with symbols that indicated unimaginable wealth buried beneath generations of cotton plants. The irony was crushing. He'd been fighting to keep a worthless school bus on land that could have solved every financial problem his family had ever faced. "Why tell me now?" he asked. Maggie's eyes filled with tears that she made no attempt to hide. "Because Sean always said the land should belong to someone who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. He served in Korea, came home to people who didn't understand what he'd sacrificed. He said if anything ever happened to us, the property should go to another soldier who needed a chance to build something lasting." She produced a will dated 6 months earlier, witnessed and notarized, transferring ownership of the mineral rights to Tom in exchange for a modest annual payment, and the promise that any development would benefit the local veteran community. "Maggie, I can't accept this," Tom said, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. "This should go to your family. "I don't have family," she interrupted gently. "Haven't had children, lost most of my relatives years ago. But I've been watching you these past months, seeing how you've taken care of that dog, how you've tried to build something beautiful out of nothing. That's what family does, Thomas. That's what love looks like." The fourth revelation came from Chris, who'd been conducting his own investigation into the anonymous threats and vandalism that had plagued the property. Using skills developed during his banking career, he'd traced social media accounts and cross-referenced them with public records until he'd identified the source of their harassment. "It's Billy Ray Stevens," Chris announced, showing Tom a series of screenshots from Facebook and Instagram. 34 years old, Army veteran, lost his service dog to cancer last year. He's been posting about you for weeks, calling you a fraud and a disgrace to the uniform. The profile photos showed a man whose eyes held the same hollow pain Tom recognized in his own mirror. Billy Ray's service dog had been a German Shepherd mix named Ranger, and the timestamps on his increasingly hostile posts corresponded exactly with the dates of the vandalism incidents at the bus. He's not evil, Tom realized, studying the progression of Billy Ray's social media presence from proud veteran to bitter antagonist. He's grieving. He sees Libby and the puppies, and it reminds him of what he lost. The pattern was heartbreakingly familiar. Another veteran struggling with civilian life, lashing out at targets that represented the happiness he couldn't achieve for himself. Tom had been so focused on defending his position that he'd failed to recognize the pain driving his attacker's behavior. The final revelation came from Dr. Chen during an emergency call about Libby's condition. The mastitis had worsened despite treatment, and one of the puppies had developed symptoms that suggested a more serious underlying problem. "I need to run some tests," Dr. Chen explained, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of medical professionals delivering concerning news. "But I think we might be dealing with a genetic condition that affects temperature regulation and immune system development." The implications were staggering. If the puppies carried inherited health problems, their value as adoption candidates would plummet. More importantly, Libby's breeding capability, something Tom hadn't even known existed until recently, might be compromised by conditions that could have been prevented with proper genetic screening. "The good news," Dr. Chen continued, "is that with proper care and specialized nutrition, All the puppies should survive to healthy adulthood. The bad news is that the care they'll need is expensive and time-intensive. We're talking about several $1,000s in veterinary bills over the next 6 months. Tom sat in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he'd believed about his life. His military service had been honorable rather than shameful. His ex-wife had been supporting him financially for years rather than abandoning him completely. The land beneath his bus contained enough wealth to solve every problem his family faced. His antagonist was a fellow veteran in need of help rather than an enemy to be defeated. And through it all, Libby and her puppies represented not just the responsibilities that had driven him to build a home in a school bus, but a connection to purpose and meaning that transcended the conventional definitions of success and failure that had tormented him since coming home from war. The revelations had turned his understanding of reality inside out, but they'd also created new possibilities that seemed too enormous to comprehend. Tom looked around the sterile hospital environment that felt like a way station between his old life and whatever came next, wondering how someone rebuilt their entire worldview while their mother lay dying and their family waited for decisions that would determine all their futures. Outside the hospital windows, the Alabama sun was setting over cotton fields that held secrets worth millions of dollars, watched over by a rusted school bus that had become the unlikely center of a story about love, sacrifice, and the strange ways that broken things sometimes become the foundation for building something beautiful. Dorothy's voice, weak but determined, drifted from her hospital bed. "Thomas, come here. We need to talk about what happens next." The revelations were complete, but the real work of healing was just beginning. The transformation began at Dorothy's bedside, where 4 generations of Mitchell family stories converged into a single moment of clarity. Dorothy had insisted on being moved back to the house where she'd raised Tom, refusing the clinical efficiency of hospice care in favor of dying in the bedroom where she'd nursed sick children and worried through sleepless nights about a son at war. The house itself had become a staging ground for what Tom was already thinking of as the most complex mission of his life. Patricia had moved into the guest room, taking leave from her job to coordinate Dorothy's care, while David handled the legal paperwork for the mineral rights transfer. Chris had converted the living room into a command center, laptops and legal documents covering every surface as he researched veteran housing programs and construction permits. Rebecca arrived each morning after her hospital shifts, bringing medical supplies and the kind of professional calm that comes from years of managing family crises. Libby and her puppies had been relocated to Dorothy's enclosed sun porch, where Dr. Chen had helped Tom set up a proper veterinary recovery area. The space was warm, easily cleaned, and close enough to the house that Tom could monitor both his mother's condition and Libby's recovery without exhausting himself running between responsibilities. The first major decision came when Billy Ray Stevens appeared at the front door on a Thursday morning, holding his service dog's collar and wearing the hollow expression of someone who'd run out of places to hide from his own pain. Tom recognized the look immediately. It was the same face he'd seen in mirrors for years after coming home from war. "I need to apologize," Billy Ray said, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "I've been the one messing with your bus, posting the nasty stuff online. I saw you with your dog and her puppies, and it made me so angry that you got to keep yours when mine died alone in some veterinary clinic while I was stuck in traffic trying to get to her." Tom stepped onto the porch, studying the younger veteran with the careful assessment that came from years of evaluating threats. But Billy Ray wasn't a threat. He was a casualty. Another soldier who'd made it home physically intact but spiritually shattered. "What was her name?" Tom asked. "Ranger. She was a Belgian Malinois, served 2 tours in Afghanistan before they partnered her with me for stateside duty." Got bone cancer at 8 years old, and the VA said they couldn't justify the treatment costs for a retired asset. Billy Ray's voice cracked on the last words, the bureaucratic language failing to contain the magnitude of his loss. Tom felt the familiar burn of institutional betrayal, the way military bureaucracy reduced living beings to equipment numbers and cost-benefit analyses. She wasn't an asset. She was family. Yeah, she was. Billy Ray looked at the collar in his hands, studying the worn leather and faded name tag. I heard about your mama being sick, and I wanted you to know I'm sorry for adding to your troubles. You don't deserve what I put you through. The conversation might have ended there. Another veteran apologizing for behavior driven by grief and moving on to continue struggling alone. But Tom saw something in Billy Ray's posture that reminded him of his own darkest moments. The particular slump of shoulders that belonged to someone contemplating permanent solutions to temporary problems. You got anywhere to be right now? Tom asked. Billy Ray shrugged, the gesture encompassing weeks of unemployment and the kind of aimless desperation that made every day feel like an endurance test. Not really. Libby's got 4 puppies that need round-the-clock feeding and socialization. I could use someone with experience handling military working dogs to help with their care while I'm dealing with family stuff. Wouldn't pay much, but there's room to stay if you need it. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Billy Ray studied Tom's face, looking for signs of pity or manipulation, finding only the straightforward assessment of one soldier evaluating another's capabilities. You're serious, after everything I did? I'm serious because of everything you did. Take someone who understands what these dogs mean to properly care for them. And Libby could probably use the company of someone who speaks her language. The second major decision came when the mining company representatives arrived with contracts that promised to transform the Mitchell family's financial situation overnight. The numbers were staggering. $15 million in mineral rights, with the potential for ongoing royalties that could support multiple generations. But the contracts also included provisions for industrial development that would fundamentally alter the character of the land. Heavy machinery, processing facilities, and the kind of large-scale extraction that turned farmland into moonscapes. Tom stood in Dorothy's kitchen, studying geological surveys and environmental impact assessments, feeling the weight of decisions that would affect not just his family, but the entire rural community. You don't have to decide today, the lead representative said, his tone carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to life-changing negotiations. But the offer won't remain on the table indefinitely. Market conditions change, and our development timeline has certain constraints. Tom looked through the window at the cotton fields where his great-grandfather had built their first cabin, where his father had taught him to drive a tractor, where he'd played as a child before learning that the world beyond their property line could be dangerous and unforgiving. The land held 4 generations of Mitchell family stories, but it also represented the financial security his children would need to build their own futures. What if we modified the terms? Chris suggested, his banking background evident in his careful phrasing. Partial development rights with environmental restrictions and community benefit requirements. We keep enough acreage for the family homestead while allowing limited extraction that funds veteran housing programs. The negotiation stretched across 3 days, with lawyers and accountants shuttling between the house and the mining company's offices. Tom found himself caught between his desire to preserve the land and his responsibility to provide for his family's future. The compromise they eventually reached satisfied no one completely, but offered something valuable to everyone involved: limited mining rights that would fund a veteran housing community while preserving the core of the family property. The third decision was the most personal and the most difficult. Dorothy's condition had deteriorated rapidly, the cancer spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Morrison estimated days rather than weeks, and the family found themselves confronting the reality of final conversations and last wishes. "I want to see the bus," Dorothy said during a brief moment of clarity, her voice weak but determined. "I want to see what you built before I go." The logistics seemed impossible. Dorothy could barely sit upright without assistance, and the journey from her bedroom to the bus would require medical equipment and careful coordination. But Tom recognized the request for what it was, not a whim, but a final expression of maternal pride in her son's accomplishments. The procession that moved Dorothy from her house to the bus looked like a small-scale military operation. Patricia coordinated medical supplies while Rebecca managed Dorothy's oxygen equipment and pain medication. Chris and Billy Ray had spent hours cleaning and organizing the bus interior, removing anything that might interfere with a wheelchair or medical equipment. Libby and her puppies were temporarily relocated to give Dorothy maximum space and comfort. When Dorothy finally entered the bus, supported by a transport chair and surrounded by her family, her reaction was everything Tom had hoped for and more. She studied the custom cabinetry, ran her fingers along the smooth finish of the handcrafted trim, and examined the ingenious space-saving solutions that made the small interior feel spacious and welcoming. "Thomas," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "This is beautiful. This is a real home." The validation he'd been seeking for months came not from county inspectors or public approval, but from the woman who'd taught him that home was built with love rather than purchased with money. Dorothy spent her last conscious hours in the bus, surrounded by 3 generations of family, and watched over by Libby, who seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment. She died peacefully 2 days later, holding Tom's hand while Libby's puppies played quietly in their enclosure nearby. Her final words were addressed to her son, but meant for everyone who'd gathered to say goodbye. "You built something beautiful, baby. Now help other people build beautiful things too." The funeral drew hundreds of people, former students, fellow teachers, neighbors, veterans, and complete strangers who'd followed the family's story through news coverage and social media. The service was held in the cotton field beside the bus, with Dorothy's casket surrounded by flowers from across the state. Tom spoke about his mother's life with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to defusing bombs, each word carefully chosen to honor her memory while acknowledging the complex legacy she was leaving behind. He talked about her 40 years of teaching, her unwavering faith in the power of education, and her final lesson about building homes with love rather than convention. But it was Billy Ray who delivered the eulogy that brought the crowd to tears, speaking about how Dorothy had welcomed him into her family's crisis without question or judgment, offering him the chance to find purpose in caring for creatures who couldn't care for themselves. "Mrs. Mitchell never met me before this week," he said, his voice carrying across the field. "But she looked at me and saw something worth saving. That's what teachers do. They see potential where other people see problems. She taught me that taking care of something small and vulnerable isn't a burden. It's a privilege." As dirt covered Dorothy's casket and the crowd gradually dispersed, Tom stood in the doorway of his bus with Libby at his side, looking out over land that now held both his past and his future. The mineral rights would provide financial security. The veteran housing community would give meaning to his mother's sacrifice, and the small space he'd built with his own hands had proven itself capable of holding both birth and death, joy and sorrow, the full range of human experience. The bus was no longer just shelter. It had become the foundation for building something larger, something that would outlast any individual life and serve as a testament to the power of creating beauty from broken materials. Dorothy's passing marked not an ending, but a transformation that would ripple through the lives of everyone she'd touched. Tom stood at his mother's graveside as the last mourners departed, feeling the weight of her final challenge settling on his shoulders like a familiar pack. She'd seen what he could build when driven by necessity. Now she was asking him to build something driven by purpose. The mineral rights money arrived 3 weeks later, deposited into accounts that transformed the Mitchell family's financial reality overnight. But wealth, Tom discovered, came with its own complications. Chris quit his job search to focus on establishing the Dorothy Mitchell Foundation for veteran housing. Rebecca used her portion to fund a rural healthcare clinic specializing in PTSD treatment. Patricia, surprising everyone, divorced David and used her settlement to purchase adjacent farmland for the housing community. Billy Ray had become more than a temporary helper. He'd evolved into Tom's partner in what was emerging as a full-scale operation. The bus served as their headquarters while they designed and built the first phase of what would become known as Mitchell Veterans Village, a collection of tiny homes, workshop spaces, and communal facilities surrounding the original cotton fields. Each home was built to the same standards Tom had applied to the bus: functional, beautiful, and designed by people who understood what it meant to create safety from chaos. The waiting list grew longer each week as word spread through veteran communities across the Southeast. Men and women who'd served their country but struggled to find their place in civilian society began arriving with their own stories of displacement and hope. Libby's puppies, now healthy and fully weaned, became the community mascots. Each was adopted by a veteran family, creating an extended network of canine companions who seemed to understand their humans' invisible wounds. The smallest female, the one Tom had nursed through her first critical night, went to Billy Ray, who named her Dorothy in honor of the woman who'd taught him that caring for vulnerable creatures was a privilege, not a burden. The community attracted attention from politicians and journalists who wanted to study their innovative approach to veteran homelessness. But Tom learned to deflect most media requests, preferring to let the work speak for itself. The bus had taught him that the most meaningful accomplishments rarely fit into sound bites or photo opportunities. 6 months after Dorothy's death, Rebecca announced her engagement to Dr. Morrison during a community barbecue held in the cotton field where Tom had first parked his bus. The proposal took place at sunset, with Libby and her grown puppies forming a circle around the couple as Chris provided unofficial photography, and Patricia wiped away tears she didn't try to hide. "I want to get married here," Rebecca told Tom later that evening as they sat on the bus steps watching fireflies dance above the cotton plants, "in the place where our family learned how to heal." The wedding planning became a community project. Margaret O'Sullivan, now a permanent resident of the village, despite owning her own farm, took charge of flowers and decorations. Billy Ray and Chris designed and built an outdoor chapel using timber from trees cleared for the housing construction. Dr. Chen volunteered to provide veterinary care for any service dogs attending the ceremony. But it was Patricia who surprised everyone by offering to officiate the wedding. She'd gotten her online ordination and spent weeks writing a ceremony that incorporated military traditions, family history, and the particular wisdom that comes from watching broken things become beautiful through patient care and unconditional love. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of cotton blossoms and the distant sound of hammers as work continued on new homes. The chapel was filled with an unlikely congregation: veterans and their families, former neighbors who'd become supporters, medical professionals, and local residents who'd been transformed from skeptics into advocates. Tom walked Rebecca down an aisle lined with service dogs, their handlers standing at attention in dress uniforms that hadn't been worn since discharge ceremonies. Libby served as ring bearer, carrying the bands in a custom pouch that matched the one she'd worn during her military service. Patricia's ceremony drew from scripture, military code, and Dorothy's own words about building homes with love rather than money. She spoke about the strange journey that had brought them all together in this cotton field, about the ways that crisis could become opportunity when met with courage and creativity. "Tom taught us that home isn't a place you find," Patricia said, her voice carrying across the field. It's something you build one day at a time with whatever materials you have available. Rebecca and James, you're not just joining your lives together, you're adding to the foundation that will support future generations of family and community. The reception continued past midnight, with music provided by a veteran band and food contributed by every family in the village. Tom danced with his daughter, his ex-wife, and Margaret O'Sullivan, each dance representing a different chapter in his journey from isolation to belonging. As the celebration wound down, Tom found himself alone in the bus for the first time in months. The space felt different now, not like a refuge from the world, but like a launching pad for engaging with it. Through the windows he could see the lights of a dozen tiny homes, each sheltering a family that was learning to rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. Libby settled beside him on the familiar steps, her graying muzzle resting on his knee as they watched the last wedding guests make their way home. The bus had served its purpose as emergency shelter, but its true legacy lay in the community that had grown around it, a testament to the power of refusing to accept the limitations that others tried to impose. Tom pulled out his grandfather's journal and turned to a passage he'd marked months earlier. A man's greatest accomplishment isn't what he builds for himself, but what he builds that outlasts him. Looking out over Mitchell Veterans Village, Tom knew that Dorothy's final lesson had been learned and put into practice. The bus would remain their headquarters, the place where it all began, but the real home they'd built extended far beyond its rust-patched walls to encompass acres of possibility and dozens of lives that had found new purpose through the simple act of caring for one another. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more veterans needing homes, more bureaucrats requiring persuasion, more opportunities to prove that society's discarded people could create something valuable when given the chance. But tonight, Tom Mitchell sat in the doorway of his converted school bus, surrounded by the sounds of a community at peace, knowing that he'd finally found his way home. Sometimes we think we've lost everything when life strips away what we thought defined us: career, marriage, home, health. But Tom and Dorothy Mitchell's story reminds us that our greatest chapters often begin in our darkest moments, when we're forced to rebuild with nothing but love, determination, and the people willing to stand beside us. The bus wasn't just shelter. It became the foundation for healing an entire family and community. Have you ever discovered unexpected strength during your own life's most challenging transitions? What broken things in your life might actually be building materials for something beautiful? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.